I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune. On behalf of my colleagues at the Trib, I want to welcome you to this year's Texas Tribune Festival. Every one of our 11 years in business, the work of our nonprofit newsroom has been critically important, but never more than in 2020. We produce reliable, credible reporting on issues that affect everyday Texans, making them better informed and motivating them to participate civically. You and people like you, readers, supporters, attendees at our events, make our public service journalism possible. If you've managed to make it this far into the festival without becoming a Tribune member, well, there's still time. Donate by September 30th at texastribune.org/give, and your gift will be triple matched by our friends at the Lowy Law Firm in Austin. Now on with the show. I hope you enjoy this conversation between former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, and Chris Hayes, the host of MSNBC's All In with Chris Hayes.
Hello there. I'm Chris Hayes. I'm the host of MSNBC's All In with Chris Hayes, also the podcast Why Is This Happening, which you are listening to right now, and it's being recorded as part of MSNBC's partnership with the Texas Tribune Festival, the all-you-can-stream virtual event, since that's how events work these days. My guest today, I'm very excited to speak with Ambassador Samantha Power, the former United States Ambassador to the UN, author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, The Education of an Idealist, which is a great book, fascinating book. We've got a lot of things to talk about because the world is aflame. And so we're going to just dive right in. Ambassador Power, it's great to have you.
Chris, thanks for doing this.
Let's start. I thought we would maybe start with the sort of U.S., where the U.S. is in the world right now. It's been striking to me how much the U.S., and there's been writing about this, has become a kind of object of pity. Around the world, people look over and when you look at a place like Vietnam, right, which has 1/10 of our per capita GDP and has done a much better job of containing coronavirus, Germany, all kinds of countries. What does it do to the U.S.? What does it do to U.S. soft power or stature or even just sort of like our role on the world to be having this awful national humiliation?
Well, first of all, just to unpack the sources of humiliation and isolation, right, range from Trump attacking people like you in the media, attacking democratic institutions. Let's not forget actually stripping the words nation of immigrants from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service kind of mandate and all the immigration restrictions that have flowed therefrom, the Muslim ban, and then, and of course, one could go on and we'd lose our 30 minutes, but then to lead the world in coronavirus infections and in deaths and the mishandling of that. And then, of course, pulling out of international organizations, which he was doing before Corona in other realms, but to do so on an issue of such global concern. I mean, that sort of hits anybody who's themselves fearful about whether Corona might come to a neighborhood near them, right in the gut, right? I mean, for America to walk away from its role and to reject even the idea that our fates are connected to those individuals. So it's not altogether surprising, of course, that our standing has dropped. It is really noteworthy just how precipitous those drops have been, even in my home country of Ireland, where I came from a long time ago, where you just have such long-standing warm ties, and it's really Trump is now viewed less favorably than President Putin and President Xi in many European and friendly Asian countries, and that's really sort of striking. I will say, before I get to the important question that you posed, which is what difference does it make? But people are still distinguishing in many of those same polls between Trump and the United States. So they're still kind of holding out hope that this was something of an aberration. Those same places where Trump's favorability might be in the 20s or even the teens, according to Pew, you'd see, favorability ratings for the United States as a whole above 50%, kind of still hanging on. That, of course, will change if we, the American people, are seen to have affirmed the kinds of decisions and the kinds of results that Trump has brought us. I think the reason it matters, and Trump is quick to deride these polls and saying, "Oh, you see, Barack Obama wanted to win a popularity contest in Berlin. I want to bring jobs to the American worker." But it matters because it really, especially in democracies, it really shrinks the space that democratic leaders have to partner with the U.S. And I think you see that on and some of this you wouldn't play out until it's the rainy day and you really need partners. But for example, on something that the Obama administration, the Trump administration agreed on, which is that European countries need to spend more on defense, Trump's extortionist way of asking for those bump ups in defense expenditures, his implicit and at times explicit, at least behind the scenes, explicit threat to leave NATO if people don't start paying up. That certainly gets the attention of a leader. But that leader then, if it's a democracy and a European democracy, has to go before their parliament, go before their own voters. And if it's seen to the voters as needing to do something to please a person who has fared worse in terms of competence, who is demonstrably uncredible when it comes to the words out of his mouth, but also any specter of threat that he might invoke, right? That is going to just make it a lot harder for those very difficult domestic conversations to occur. And there are, 100 such examples, but I really do think your question is so important because Biden will be debating Trump here in these 3 debates, and, he will need to move beyond "we are isolated and doesn't it suck to be mistrusted" to "this is why this matters to you, American people. This is why we are less safe because the standing of our leader now hovers beneath that of President Putin, who poisons his opponents."
You mentioned President Xi and sort of the polling on China in the context of President Putin and others, right? It strikes me that China is sort of the main axis here, and in both the main axis for COVID, and also it seems clearer and clearer like one of the major foreign policy challenges for the next U.S. president is going to be managing the bilateral U.S. China relationship. It's basically the key to us not burning the planet down, sort of above everything else. And then there's a whole bunch of different ways it can go right now where it seems worryingly like on one hand, we could be headed towards a sort of new Cold War. On the other hand, like the old model, both in terms of industrial trade flows and also just like looking other way while an ethnic minority is being thrown into camps, doesn't quite work. And the answer to like what to do is very complicated, but what do you see? I mean, do you agree this is just a sort of primary foreign policy challenge? And how do you think through it? Because it's such a thorny question.
We own the thorns, Chris. I think you've articulated it very, very well. I mean, it's one thing you hear all these politicians saying, we will compete, we will confront, we will collaborate. Much easier said than done, but nonetheless, that's the stew in which we must live as we go forward. And it's not like the U.S.-Soviet standoff because, as you note, we are so unbelievably interconnected economically because the fate of our economy is so tied to what happens inside China, as we've seen also with the pandemic, but well beyond that, as you say, with supply chains and other sort of sinews and capillaries that run in both directions, where there's a kind of codependence of some kind that will, I think, get re-examined and maybe scaled back in light of the vulnerabilities that have been exposed over the course of the last year. But, we're not going back to, 1972, right, in terms of U.S. Soviet ties. That ship has sailed. So, and at the same time, as you say, I think actually one of the reasons that human rights and democratic values will come to matter a great deal in this really difficult mix of competition and confrontation with needing to collaborate on climate and a number of other issues but is that in this battle between two models globally, an authoritarian capitalist model and a democratic model, one of our comparative advantages at this point, one of our really distinguishing features is the fact that our citizens, get to speak freely, pray freely, not get locked up. We hope anyway on the basis of their faith or their ethnicity, and that's something that as we seek to build out the community of people who share our values, that is where we get back in the business of trying to lead at the UN and elsewhere, that's really going to matter. And the fact that the United States, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, if you actually combine our economic heft in the world, then you really start to be able to exact leverage, not only on China, but also in the very large number of countries that feel increasingly economically dependent on China or dependent on China potentially for a vaccine or for PPE. But only by us sort of actually celebrating almost with the big caveats associated with our own democracy that we'll maybe get into, but to take note that openness is a virtue and that having these shared values should be grounds for coordinating our actions and for being more effective when we compete and when we confront. That also, I think, if we have sufficient leverage, will make it easier to hold China accountable for Hong Kong and the Uyghurs and unfair trade practices and theft of intellectual property and the long list of things that they need to be held accountable for, but still be in a position because of our leverage to be able to sit China down and sort of somehow find a way forward on issues of shared concern, as we did, in the Paris Agreement context, but in a very different, as you say, a very different geopolitical context with a much, sort of more stable and much more accommodating, mutually accommodating relationship. And that I don't think there's any going back to that kind of backdrop for cooperation. So I think leverage is going to be a huge predictor of whether we can sit them down. In addition to the fact that, by the way, on one reason that we can feel freer, I think, to compete and to hold them accountable on human rights issues, hopefully in greater company than we do now in a broader coalition, but is that by definition that set of issues that we need to sit down with China on are issues of mutual concern. And so to have also the confidence of knowing that President Xi also can't afford to let the planet burn. We do live on the same earth, and that interdependence creates necessities and exigencies on their part as well.
It's interesting when you mentioned this is not a 1970s, right, U.S. Soviet Cold War model to think about. And yet, when you talk about the idea of two competing models, there's that's a very, I think, clear and present part of the sense of kind of post-globalization, right? What it looks like. And to bring it back to the coronavirus, when you think back to the sort of Soviet propaganda war with the U.S. over things like, the Khrushchev kitchen table debate and sending the first spacecraft, right, with a dog in it. And that was a big deal. The Soviet models, their engineers figured out how to send something up into space before we did, and we were racing with them. If you transported COVID back into that context, it would be the Chinese model's better. They crack down, and yes, you get 90 temperature checks and you got surveillance tracking you everywhere you go, but there's probably several 100,000 Chinese alive and walking around now because their authoritarian surveillance model was able to suppress a disease that our open, happy, democratic model has completely failed at. And it seems to be there's a real tangible way in which when you think about these two models in some kind of competition or something that the world is evaluating, that their response in the beginning looked horrible, but it doesn't look as horrible now when you compare it to ours.
I think that's right. I think that people are inevitably drawing that lesson, right? China already had going for it the rejection of the longstanding assumption that prosperity and freedom civil and political freedom needed to go hand in hand. So
right.
they'd already sort of, boasted to the world, look, that argument no longer holds. Now they're saying, look, when it comes to a crisis, who would you prefer to have in charge? Yeah, President Xi or President Trump. But I mean, let's unpack this a little bit, Chris, because we don't need to. Even if that impression is one that China is seeking to project, I think we need to distinguish the like and the unlike, right? I mean, we have in President Trump a uniquely catastrophic denier of science, right? There's not one president in the last 100 years who would have rejected scientific expertise, even sort of bureaucratic procedure, would have rejected global cooperation when there was a chance actually to glean insights from other countries with a staggered spread of a disease that the only benefit of which is that you actually get to learn from what has come before and be prepared for it. I mean, a challenge that America would have under any leader, and we lived this in the Ebola crisis, is federalism, and is the fact that you do whatever about authoritarian or democratic or closed or open. There just is the fact that we have the 50 states who each, fundamentally are going to be driving the state response. And this is an issue on elections as well, and election protection and preventing election interference. There are these really important national security issues where everybody expects the federal government to put in place a plan and execute that plan, or should expect that. And yet the actual authorities lie elsewhere. And in a polarized world, the willingness of Republicans potentially to listen to and heed the admonitions or even just the guidelines, because sometimes that's all the federal government can muster, or to be responsive to the convening power of the federal government. Polarization can really mess with that. And again, we saw that on Ebola in a big way. Now you see, of course, Democratic governors and many Republican governors just ignoring, Trump's guidance and even that of his what are meant to be very technocratic, science-based agencies. But all of this to say, this is a pretty distinct departure, I think, from what Democratic leadership has looked like in the past. Not that we've ever dealt with, anything quite like COVID. And there are plenty of democracies that have nobody has kicked this thing and it really inoculated themselves. Probably the closest is Taiwan, and actually shows in some ways the best contrast, because even though there are restrictions on privacy and trackings, via cell phones and things that probably would go too far in many democracies, by and large, it's been a crowdsourced response
Civil
where people, incredible civil society, social media companies actually playing, hooray, a constructive role. Trust in government growing, not receding as the crisis unfolds. My point is, I think that if you look at the key ingredients for a response, beyond what China is trying to put out there, and what Trump in some ways, makes more resonant every day, he bungles the response in a new way, or again, sort of sidelines the actual assets that we do have in this country that could make us, a leader in many dimensions of this. I think the key ingredients are legitimacy of leadership, trust. Frankly, some far more unity than we have in our democracy, at least an ability to rally around the flag on some issues. I mean, in many of those democracies that have fared well, like Taiwan and New Zealand, I mean, it's not as if they don't have issues of political division. Of course they have those, but those gave way in the main in the face of a crisis like this. But I think people will draw the correlative lesson, and it's part of the larger question about whether America's recovery and standing, it will not be simply about who wins an election and whether we like alliances again, or whether we treat, other leaders respectfully and stop cozying up to autocratic leaders. It will be about whether we can show our competence, whether we remind the world that we're not just a country of more Nobel Prizes in the sciences and medicines than any other country in the world. It shows when it matters for our citizens and when it matters for the world.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear. I don't think the argument is correct. I just think that, like, from a propaganda perspective,
and they're milking it.
Yeah, and they
They're
are milking
milking
it. And there's, it's almost like this sort of in your face, these pictures of, like, here's the first day of school. Here's a concert where everyone's, like, topless and on top of each other in Wuhan. It's like, whoa, what? Like, we can't go to an Applebee's. Like, they're having a. So I think it also, to me, what it also connects to, the sort of idea of that sort of 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, two models, Cold War sort of divided world. And then the kind of the victory of sort of neoliberalism and globalism and the Fukuyama book and the idea that, like, the world is getting more democratic, sort of inevitably and inexorably. And now this profound sense of democratic retrenchment, right? That we've seen countries move away from liberalism, recede away from elections. Putin's Russia and Erdogan's Turkey are two examples, but there's real concerns, obviously, about democratic retrenchment in Brazil, and there's concerns about democratic retrenchment in Hungary and even Poland and in the United States. Like, I guess, how do you view our experience now and the stakes for American democracy in the kind of international context, as someone who spent a lot of time looking at the ways in which democratic governments can start to degrade towards something else in foreign context, how you think about it, what's happening here?
Well, for starters, I think that it's really worth unpacking a little bit, where these trend lines have gone over the last decade and a half. I mean, it is 14 straight years of freedom, at least as measured in terms of civil and political rights, declining around the world. 8 of those years were when I was serving in the Obama administration. And so Trump himself is both a symptom, I think, the gravitation toward a self-styled strongman, even if he's demonstrably weak in a whole series of domains. That's what he's sold himself as. You don't like chaos? Like, I'm your order guy. The more he can stir up fear, whether in law and order or anything else, the more he presents himself as a solution, even though, of course, the chaos has been massively exacerbated by him and on his watch. So he is a symptom, I think, of what you've seen in Hungary, in Poland, in the Philippines, this kind of reversion to a belief that there's an individual who can come along and solve your problems, a sort of move to personality-based politics from, faith in institutions, democratic institutions. We'll come to it, but Trump is also, of course, an accelerant of those trends in really fostering, not only domestically, but internationally, the idea that there is impunity and that leaders can do what they want. And that certainly, in terms of foreign policy, that America's not watching, right? Go at it, Mohammed bin Salman, do your thing. Poison? What poison? Putin. Yeah. What you're asking me about that? I don't have a comment. What? What? And that sort of age of impunity, now, you can project out. It's going to be very hard to sort of turn back the clock, given that sense of emboldenment, and given, frankly, the fact that norms are fragile, and part of norms working and constraining individual behavior and state behavior is some kind of intuition that others are doing it too, and that there'd be some cost somewhere if you didn't, even though again, the power of norms is that you're not really doing this calculus day to day. Well, now people are really starting to do the calculus, and they're thinking, right. Actually, I can probably get away with this or that. So that, irrespective again of who wins the American election, that those trend lines were underway. But what was the oxygen that these leaders really fed off? I mean, I think there's always a base in any society of people who might have been drawn to a populist and xenophobic message, but the numbers increased because people were feeling tremendous dislocation in terms of their economic plights, perhaps, in terms of, above all, I think their dignity and their sense of self-respect, or that they could deliver something for their families, come home at night, feel good about themselves. And when you lose that, I think the propensity to listen to somebody, not only who's promising order and change, but who has found you a villain to plant your grievances. Yeah. I think that's the pattern that you see in so many of these examples. But there's a lot of historical contingency. You mentioned Fukuyama, and I think you and I came of age. I'm a little older than you, but in that generation where this idea of this inexorable progress was, there's motherhood, there was apple pie, and then there was liberal democracy. It was all going to work out. And what's sad is I see my students entering a world where they're kind of told the exact opposite, right? That it's an inexorable set of trends, right. But toward what? Toward the China model? Really? Like, actually, there's nothing sort of superseding that lies in each and every person, a kind of longing to express themselves, a longing to hold accountable leaders who are failing you. I mean, look at the early phases of the China pandemic and the rage on social media, and even when the costs of expressing that rage are what they are. I mean, when one's expectations are disappointed, you are going to see people longing to, as we see in this country, to participate, to throw the bastards out, to practice accountability, and to express dignity and agency in this other way. So I think that it's far too soon to write the obituary, but America, just as Trump has been an accelerant of the age of impunity, so too, having in place an America that is prepared to lead on this set of issues, that is prepared to hold itself accountable to a set of standards in terms of what our own citizens are, whether there is equality or anything, whether the trend lines are even moving in the right direction on race or on gender, on anything else domestically, but as well with humility after these 4 years to be in a position where other leaders are like, dang, they're back. Now we're going to have to be hearing the whining about this attack on the media. Now I'm not actually going to be joined by the American president attacking judges and fake news and enemies of the people.
Right.
Darn it.
Right.
Now Joe Biden's going to be on me. And well, maybe. Right. So my point is that there are a lot of interdependencies in all of this. And I think it's a scrum. I mean, look at the people of Sudan, all these trend lines, China's on the rise, China support means that things are going to go in an inexorably undemocratic direction. The Sunnis people, including Sunnis women, didn't get that memo, right? And they went out day after day. 2/3 of the protesters in Sudan last year were women, and they now have a really difficult odds, really tough. Lots, you're going to have to handicap their prospects. But Bashir, person responsible for genocide, who was counting on Chinese backing and those trend lines, is now sitting in jail, and they're talking about potentially even sending him to the International Criminal Court. So even with these trends, there are these carve-outs that show human agency in all of this.
You just mentioned the International Criminal Court, and I just I feel like I need to ask you about this before I let you go, because the ICC is kind of the sort of institution that I think, like, if you go back through your work in America in the Age of Genocide, like the idea of having some internationally constituted body that can actually adjudicate like crimes against humanity or war crimes and be staffed by people from different countries and actually produce a kind of level playing field of accountability where, like, yes, like the U.S. could be subject to jurisdiction. It's not just victor's justice, right? That, like, the ICC is all those things. And because it's all those things, at least in conception, it's always been opposed by the American right. It's like the Jesse Helms 2.0's feeling about the UN, right? Like, who's these people? But I just maybe thought your reaction to the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo thing, like, it was in the news for half a day, in which we individually sanctioned members of the ICC as if they were the war criminals. Like, we attach sanctions to them the way that we would to, like, a Russian gun runner who's, like, shipping weapons illegally all over the world, to the judges that are attempting to bring to justice actual international criminals. It's, like, completely backwards and abhorrent and shocking. And I just would love to hear your reaction to it as someone who's invested in the kind of system of justice that the ICC does represent.
Well, I should mention that the threat was also to sanction their families, right? As if, and again, the damage this does to U.S. credibility, to, where we pride ourselves, if our democratic model, has at its core anything in the justice space, it is the idea of due process and individual rights and so forth. And suddenly, you're sanctioning people who are studying evidence of grave crimes against humanity and mass atrocity. I mean, to even make it onto the docket of the International Criminal Court, the bar is, in part because the U.S. helped draft the Rome Statute, the bar is really high. And as you say, for the response to be to shoot the messenger, when what you need to do in the face of international justice, in order to be able to just rely on your own sovereign system, is simply to carry out thorough investigations of your own, to investigate people who are accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and have accountable justice, whether within your military justice system or within your criminal justice system. And let's not forget, Chris, that the decision to sanction these international civil servants comes alongside the decision to pardon people credibly accused of war crimes. So back to the age of impunity, because it's all related, is simply the message to everyone is we can do anything we want. Why? Because we can. And the mystery is not that Trump would seek that kind of impunity for himself and his family, and as we've seen, his corruption and his self-dealing and all of the rest. The mystery and the thing that has to change is why so many people who may not have liked the ICC, but certainly believe that American soldiers who committed war crimes should be held accountable. Indeed, Lindsey Graham himself was a JAG, no less, right? Actually part of enforcing this military justice system. It is those enablers of this turn toward impunity, which is so damaging to our future ability to stand up on behalf of the rule of law and on behalf of accountability, and is just one more factor behind that drop in standing. But it is those enablers that we have to look to. And because Trump may leave us, we hope, on January 20th, 2021, but those individuals will still be there, unfortunately, if the trends continue, helping shape what America projects to the world and whether we are a country of laws or just might makes right.
Samantha Power is former UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the UN, author of, among other books, Education of Idealists, which is a fascinating memoir about her time, both before and during that position, and will probably be in public life again at some point. If I had to take a guess, you don't have to make any news here on the Texas Tribune Why Is This Happening podcast. But it's always great to talk to you, Samantha. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.